FromSoft, one of the original video game pioneers of both fantasy and mecha. From the start, they made it pretty clear that they had no issues jumping between these genres when they followed up their first series, Kingsfield, a fantasy action RPG focused on first-person dungeon crawling, with Armored Core, a third-person mecha shooter revolving around instances of missions for different corporations. Now, despite not having a truly massive success till their Souls titles took off, FromSoft never abandoned their fantasy roots as they continued to pump out games like Evergrace, Lost Kingdom, and many more alongside the various Armored Core and other mech titles. Initially, you might think it's kind of odd that FromSoft was so focused on the fantasy and mecha genres simultaneously when they're seemingly polar opposites, but if you think about it, isn't a mech just a giant suit of armor with an updated armory? Now, with that question in mind, let's dive into another one I've seen thrown around a few times since Armored Core 6 dropped. What if FromSoft combined Dark Souls and Armored Core? And when looking back at their repertoire of games, there's actually a title that answers this question. Sorta. Back before the turn of the century, FromSoft released one title and one title alone to the Sega Dreamcast, and that was Frame Gride. Debuting on July 15, 1999, Frame Gride is a tastefully done blend of mecha and fantasy that gives you a good depth of customization for these magic-powered mechs that was fairly similar to old-gen Armored Core titles. Likely to have heavy influences from the classic Aura Battler Dunbind and the Vision of Escaflowne series, the game's overall setting is very medieval with its style and delivery. Each and every choice of design was clearly made with the intention of imbuing a sort of Renaissance flair in its presentation, and between the amount of flavor poured into each visual and the amazing soundtrack by the legendary Kota Hoshino, it does such a good job of capturing this that you'd probably forget that this was still a mecha game at its core. Speaking of, well, I'll be real, this is mostly Armored Core in its delivery. Demon's Souls wouldn't even be around for another 10 years, but the trademark fantasy elements, colossal melee weapons, and magic attacks are definitely there, and lend to fairly complex, close-range arena-style fights with Souls-esque melee attacks using both your weapons and your fists, while you fought alongside 32 different summonable squires. And trust me, we'll get more in depth with that later. Now, the game starts you off with a brief excerpt of the plot that goes as follows. In an ancient empire, the Emperor Kurt chose 7 imperial candidates from the 7 kingdoms. In the year 700, when the Emperor Regilio was dying, one of the 7 candidates, Zolt, raised a rebellion against the whole empire. Zolt joined forces with the 9 fallen knights and defeated the other 5 imperial candidates. Only Melange survived. Melange brought hope. However, he was an old and sick archbishop. He summoned a knight in order to entrust him the last hope. I bestow upon thee the honorable title of Knight of the Realm. As neat as that was, if I'm being genuine, the story immediately takes a backseat after this, and the only time you get any other real insight as to what the hell is going on is only after you beat the final boss, and I honestly still don't know what it has to do with anything it tells you here. Typical cryptic and or vague FromSoft shenanigans, you know the drill. From here you are presented a series of choices to create your starter Frame Gride, but don't be mistaken. Most if not all choices are actually very viable, if not better than some other options you can create later on, and everything here can be obtained easily, so you're not doomed if you choose a set of parts that you're not super happy with right off the bat. For the very last question, it'll ask you for your birthday, and while I haven't extensively tested this, what date you choose seems to affect which of the elemental and stat stones you start out with, as the various combinations I tried would always lead to different results. Speaking of the elemental stones, these have a huge impact on your gameplay, including a type advantage system between the 4 elements. While it didn't outright negate anything, you'd have bonus and mitigated damage based on what elements were clashing, with fire having the advantage over wind, wind having it over water, water having it over earth, and then earth rounds back to having it over fire. On top of this, each and every gun and melee weapon had a different set of attacks to not only their elemental attacks, but what combos you deal with your fisticuffs. Now, your normal melee attacks will always stay the same on whatever weapon you're rocking unless you change weight classes, but your magic attack for each weapon will change. Some of the weapons do share magic attacks within an element, though most of the roster will give you something new, leading to a ton of different combinations you can try out with a variety of attacks to match your playstyle. Defensive magic is the only thing that stays the same between the elements and can be used to deflect most attacks. As for the guns and melee, you have everything from long-range attacks with insane tracking to comboing stalagmites or even fire and ice traps depending on what combo you're using. Oh, and the weight classes I mentioned? Yeah, you don't actually have to worry about calculating the exact min-max to get away with the loadout you want in this game. Instead, there are 3 separate frames for light, medium, and heavy, which you then build specific parts onto, and each frame can freely use every single weapon with only melee attacks having any impact from this. As for the other 3 stones, they're only going to impact your stats, but the very last one is probably the most important as it directly impacts your squires, and you'll probably want to stick with this one specific squire stone unless you decide to really grind out a mechanic I'm about to get into with the squire breakdown. So what are these squires? Well, basically imagine if Pokemon had a much smaller roster of magic mecha amalgamations you could create, which then brought another layer of strategy to the playing field. Though you could bring and summon a max of 5, there was a cost system that limited how many and how strong of squires you could bring by your total LF points. These points were derived from the aforementioned stat stone and your head part, with the one caveat being that you could earn a bigger LF capacity by winning more and more fights with your squires deployed and alive when you win the battle. And if you were wondering, yes, these things can permanently die. It will happen, and it will probably be your fault, though there is a chance to save them. Because once they drop to 0 FP, they have another bar of health, and as long as that doesn't hit 0, they'll still be in your party when the match ends. However, if they do die, you could still soften the blow by gathering the gems they drop. Now, if you've been paying attention to the equipment and squire screens, you may have noticed these below each of the respective entries, so let me take this opportunity to segue into the game's next mechanic. Combining gems! No, not like. Gems are a magical commodity within the game that are used in creating everything from your armor and weapons to each and every squire available on the roster. You'll usually receive them as a reward after a fight, but sometimes you just don't.
Wait, no crystals?
So, the best option to farm these is to helplessly slaughter each and every lackey before you finish off the enemy frame. Now, most of these are fairly easy to obtain, with a few definitely having a lower drop chance, but out of all the gems, there is one that is so damn hard to find that even after hours of grinding off camera, I have still yet to get more than the single drop that I got while streaming the game. I told you, beating them, I got the thing, I finally got the By the way, you can join in on the fun at twitch.tv/domomosh if you want to swing by. But outside of the elusive auriculum gem, the only ones I didn't really find too often were the 3-pointed red gem and the 4-pointed bronze gem, both of which are used in some stronger fusions, but they shouldn't be too hard to farm once you get to some of the later stages. And while we're on that note, let's round back to how the game plays out the campaign. So, after you're done with the introduction to the game, you'll head on over to the Fossil Desert stage where you'll have your first fight with Gordova, the Dawn Knight. And as you'd hope to expect from the first fight, well, this guy's just a bit of a pushover as they really don't do anything to avoid your attacks, nor do they act very aggressively. You should be able to defeat his squire, then him without any issue, earning you your first victory and hopefully a few gems. From there, it's on to the Fallen Bridge stage, where you'll be fighting Krone, the Orchid Knight, where you might actually have a little bit more trouble, as they actually play around the map and aren't afraid to go airborne, but as long as you keep moving and use the bridge for cover, you should be fine to take out their party and claim your prize. Now, I won't cover every single fight for the campaign for both spoilers and the sake of time, but I will round back to the one and only final boss later. Just know that it's a very arcade-style playthrough, though each stage does a good job getting steadily more difficult on top of getting their own unique arenas that contribute to the 15 total maps you can choose to fight in. However, revisiting a stage won't give you the same opponent as the first time. Every map but 2 will just generate a random enemy for you to fight against under one of these 5 monikers. However, if you still want to farm a specific enemy, you can still go to the Forsaken Town. This map allows you to choose from the opponents you face throughout the campaign, and they'll still have the same sets of squires, so that way you can consistently farm gems from someone. Personally, I wish you could just choose to fight anyone, anywhere, as Forsaken Town is one of the less interesting maps to me. But overall, this system works and would probably make for hours of replayability back when the game dropped. Now at this point you might be wondering, wait, why didn't I ever hear about this? Though the title menus are in English on the original version, the only reason I'm able to play Frame Gride how you're currently seeing it is because there is an English patch available online if you're willing to look around for it. Stateside, the coverage for this is fairly limited, outside of a few reviews from people who got it imported over 20 years ago, and most of them were fairly positive, so it's really up to speculation as to why it never made it overseas. If you yourself want to play it, just know that this was also before every controller had a pair of joysticks on it, so the game does use what's referred to as tank controls, which commonly put your left and right movement on the shoulder buttons. Normally you could just kind of bypass this by just changing the button assignment and putting them on the respective axis of the joystick, which is how I played through all of the old gen Armored Core games with my mech pilot setup, but as we get into the mechanics of the combat, you'll see why it's not quite that simple for Frame Gride's layout. Now, how the game interacts with all of your attacks and inputs basically boils down to two things: how close you are to each other, and whether or not you are holding down both of your strafe buttons. So unless you set up a macro to do that for you, you'll be missing out on half of your attacks if you assign the strafe buttons to your joystick. For the next part, as I go through everything, I'll be referring to the controls as their native buttons, but if I call something the T version, that attack is being done while holding the left and right triggers. Now the movement is a lot like old gen Armored Core, aside from the fact that you can't bunny hop and boosting does not cost energy. You can press A on the ground with movement to boost in any direction, and you can do this indefinitely. Pressing A a second time will cause you to go into the air, which is very useful for avoiding attacks, but you will hard land every single goddamn time. Any Armored Core vet will know just how aggravating this is, but as for the combat, you have a standard melee attack that can be used at any range by pressing B, and this doesn't consume any energy. At long range, the T version will cause you to use your melee's magic attack, sort of like an Ash of War based on your elemental stone, while close up, you'll be pulling out your melee combo, which always consists of 3 strikes, though some are objectively better than others, as some give a big enough window between attacks to pull out your shield and block the final hit. Oh, and if it wasn't obvious already, you can tell when you're considered in close range by the circle that closes down on the enemy. Now as for your gun, you'll fire it at long range by pressing Y, while the T version will lay a mine which has different properties between the different elements. At close range, pressing Y will cause you to punch, which is the only other attack to not use energy, and can be used to break open someone's guard, then true combo with the melee if they are blocking with a shield. I specify with a shield because for some reason this doesn't apply to heavyweights who can't equip them. I think the trade-off is because they don't get any of the stats from the shields, but I feel this hurts the main gameplay loop by throwing out all the rock, paper, scissors mind games that you get with this mechanic. With light and midweights, as you get into close range, you have to consider which option you choose carefully, as each one can be punished. While a heavyweight can block anything, tank the damage, then just punish you back free. It's a reoccurring theme with these heavyweights, huh, FromSoft? Now, as for the T version of punches, this is how you pull off those crazy punch combos I showed off earlier. However, these are blockable and usually consume a lot more energy than your melee combo with your weapons, so I use them sparingly to say the least. Now, speaking of blocking, it can be done at any range by pressing X. However, this doesn't allow you to turn, and you can still be struck from the side, so you want to make sure not to sit on it for too long. But when used right, it is a great asset. The T version summons a magic barrier based on its respective element, and I really think these are a waste of energy, especially Water's version. They just don't always do their job and cost a lot to use. Now for all you Armored Core fans, what if I told you this game also had what's likely the first form of assault armor? For the cost of all your energy, you could use the emergency bomb, which is basically a get the hell off me tool by pressing BY on both triggers. The most simple combat mechanic is your back weapon, which will be usable at any range and is just a matter of pressing B and Y. Nothing extra or fancy with the triggers, though these have a pretty crazy variety of attacks that range from magic missiles and rushdowns to black holes, crazily enough. Now, the very last thing is summoning your squires, which you can do by pressing A and X. Now, with combat covered and squires conveniently placed at the end for segue purposes, it's on to these badass little helpers and what they have to offer. Now, as previously mentioned, how many and how strong you could bring was determined by your LF, which I'm still not quite sure what the cap is, as a walkthrough online says it caps at 8,000, but I haven't even maxed out the earned LF, and I'm already over that. Regardless, the options you have usually give you 4 elemental variants for each of these classes of squires, with some exceptions. You got guys to fire your magic ashes of war, you got guys to fire big shockwaves. What the fuck? Yo, what the fuck? Guys that make giant explosions, guys that blow themselves up, and then you have these useless fucks who jump around aimlessly and shoot maybe once a minute. Now look, I didn't actually try out each and every squire, but if I had to choose, I'm probably a bit biased towards the wind ones, especially the Jistba, since they use the same homing wind attack as my favorite melee weapons. The Lar is also a solid choice that I brought into a ton of fights, though it seems like once you hit the 3rd or 4th page you can't go wrong as your options just become a lot stronger in exchange for a lot more of your LF points. I never did the whole party of 5 as I'd rather bring 2 or 3 really solid choices, but be aware that if you do bring 5, that friendly fire is a thing in this game and it is a two-way street. Or maybe it's an intersection, because this does mean that you can purposely keep one enemy between you and another to make them body block the shots, and it is very effective. Once you have a good set of equipment and squires, you should be able to clear most of the stages pretty easily, with only the last 3 really feeling like they pose much of a challenge before you reach the one and only boss, Zidlanel. Either way, this thing has one wicked looking design, and for its time, one of the coolest atmospheres for a boss arena, even if it's just kind of a circle as the layout. The temple transforming into phases of dreamy textures, red clouds, and aurora borealis while debris floats throughout the background really does it for me. However, the fight itself is...
well, it has a lot to be desired, and you'll probably have to fight cheese with cheese.
Zidlanel has 3 main attacks outside of their melee. They start off with a sweeping beam of energy that you definitely want to avoid as it can literally one-shot you. The second is a set of attacks from above that are fairly easy to avoid as long as you stay mobile. However, the third one is the worst as it homes in on you like a coral missile, and not only does it go out of your point of view, but is also more than likely to destroy your legs over time if you don't boost jump out of the way. And fun fact, if they turn red on the HUD or are completely destroyed, you cannot boost on the ground anymore. So if you want to avoid farming parts, I hope you save before this fight, because if any piece of equipment gets destroyed, you do have to remake them in the same way you would a squire. Now, you could technically melee this guy, but it is not worth remotely doing, as you can only attack him at the main point of his body, where they can melee you back. Making contact with the rest of his body sounds and looks like you're taking damage, but you won't actually take any. You'll just flinch, which does leave you more likely to be chained into another one of the attacks, so just probably want to avoid direct melee. During my attempts, I did try to just fight them with my favorite loadout, and after many honest efforts leading to some close calls, I decided to swap to the axe weapon in tandem with the wind gem to abuse its magic special attack. This splits up into many instances of damage, which could sometimes connect on Zidlanel's huge hitbox, leading to some pretty big damage. If you keep this up and avoid enough of the attacks, you should outpace them in a DPS race, bringing you home the win and leaving you with this ending.
After ages, there are rumors of a war that ended in the hands of a lone knight. Even amidst the chaos and destruction, people never lost hope. After the war, the elections continued for a long time. It was the beginning of a new age of peace.
Hey, thank you, Felfarin.
However, that knight was never seen again. His brave acts will never be forgotten. His legend will never die.
That seems to be the right pace to read it at. Hey, I think. Well, that was anticlimactic. I really wish this game gave a little more effort with presenting the story and overall lore, as this makes the Souls titles seem easily deciphered. Like, what the hell was Zidlanel and why was it here? Just what was the cause of the rebellion? Who is Zolt and Melange? It seems like a lot of love and effort went into the presentation and mechanics of this, so I'm just surprised that there wasn't much of an effort made to flesh out the story during the campaign, or even explain what was developing with the plot. Even if it was just more excerpts between the fights, I just wanted a little more insight as to what was happening. I wouldn't doubt that there is more to the actual lore of everything and that it was probably just cut from the game. It'd be interesting to see what FromSoft does with Frame Gride if they ever do a remakeable thing of sorts. I'd hope that they'd explore the events leading up to this as almost a prologue, tutorial sort of deal, or even just an overarching story that leads into the current one. The foundation for an interesting game is here, and I think that mixing the elements of Souls titles' exploration, story, and combat, and Armored Core's customization, scale, and well, combat again, could lead to something that bridges the gap between the Souls enthusiasts who felt Armored Core was always too mecha for their taste, and the mecha fans who have been seeking physical melee weapons and other fantasy elements with their mechs. Overall, I really enjoyed this oddity in FromSoft's library of games and could see myself spending hours grinding out all the different squires and parts back in the day, but what did y'all think of Frame Gride? Would you like to see a remake or a sequel of this? If so, would you prefer it to be more open world like the Souls titles, or more mission and arena based like the Armored Core franchise? Personally, I'd like to see something that gives big explorable chunks of areas that showcase the different environments and enemies that revolve around Frame Gride's impact in this world. There's a lot of potential for world building and enemies when combining both fantasy and sci-fi elements, which we could already see showcased in a pretty solid selection of squires. And hell, I could even see this having the potential to become a full-blown animated series if the various elements were handled correctly. But for now, we'll just have to wait and see. Appreciate y'all tuning in, and remember, a like and subscribe is always free and helps out the channel immensely. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and take care. Peace!